Good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for joining this webinar. This may not be to some of you the most exciting topic in the world, but it's fundamentally important to the success of well, any organization, but we're thinking specifically of Nature Network member groups in this context for this evening. There are a number of topics that I'm going to go through, and I will also be asking John to move slides. So John Hassel is our communications director, is in the background operating the slides. So John, could you move to the first slide? Yeah, so the topics that I'm going to cover this evening are incorporation and charitable status. We'll hear a little bit from you because I have a couple of polls. So that's where you can respond to the polls that we'll have in the webinar. Not-for-profit and charity law, liabilities, board liabilities or organizational liabilities, board positions, board job descriptions and work plans, decision-making and delegation, board workload and burnout, and board recruitment. And I want to just clarify right now, related to the earlier topics, I am not a lawyer. So what I'm going to speak about is basically the information and knowledge that I have, both from my almost 18 years, I think it is 18 years with Ontario Nature, but also the boards that I have been a member of, some of which have been of larger organizations with staff, but I also have been on boards that are solely volunteer organizations. So I think with that, we'd like to ask you a couple of questions. So we've got a couple of polls, and John is going to bring those polls up. And I'll just explain them a little bit once they're up. So John, if you could launch the first poll. So we're going to force you to kind of make a decision. And I know many of you would be inclined to say, all of the above or something like that. But we want to hear from you what you as individuals associated with your organization and your experiences with your groups, what you think are your biggest challenges or your biggest challenge, singular. And we'll just leave the poll up for, I think it's about 45 seconds, John said, and he can tell when the responses are sort of slowing up. So he can call it when it's, it's time to close the poll, and then maybe we can just discuss a little bit the results.
Okay, looks like all the results are in now, so I'll just end the poll.
Okay. So, but it's still on the screen. Yeah. So that's interesting and not surprising. We've heard, and certainly, people like Leslie and Barbara Mackenzie-Winia have heard, I guess, repeatedly at regional meetings that board succession and recruitment is a big challenge. And that's something that I'd like to address, and with the sort of questions that we also would like to hear if there are any particular strategies that any of you have employed that are sort of successful for any of these things. So thank you very much for that. And it's interesting actually that understanding and complying with legal requirements is not considered a big challenge. In my mind, that's a huge challenge with any board because it is very complex. but it wouldn't. You're forced to make one choice. So yeah, very interesting that the clear sort of leader is the issue of board succession. So, John, if can we launch the next poll? So this question here is just to get a sense of those of you who are participating in this webinar, what category your organization fits into. And I'll be talking a little bit about incorporation and, being a registered charity or not being incorporated and not being a charity. And I have some actual data on all of the nature network groups, which I'll share with you, but I wanted to just get a snapshot of who we have on the webinar tonight.
Okay, so I'll give 5 more seconds. Almost everybody's responded. Oh, there we go. Everybody's responded.
Okay, great. And so it looks like the majority of those on the call, on the webinar, are incorporated as a not-for-profit and are also registered as charities. So that's very interesting. No one's responded saying that they're a registered, or their organization is a registered charity but not incorporated. So it's interesting. I'll actually now show you the what it actually looks like for the Nature Network in its entirety. John, if you could go to the next slide. Oh, and you can close the poll just by clicking on it if it's still showing on your screens. So in actual fact, so 66% of Nature Network groups are incorporated, and almost all of these are incorporated in Ontario. I just found 2 that were federally incorporated, and both of those are not the more sort of traditional, smaller nature group or friends of group, that kind of thing. So it wasn't surprising that they are incorporated federally. And 57 of Nature Network groups are registered charities. 46 are both incorporated and registered charities, and 27% are neither incorporated nor a registered charity. And it's important to note that you don't have to be incorporated to apply for charitable status. And to the best of my research, 12 Nature Network groups have charitable status but aren't incorporated. So kind of a mixed bag, but what I actually thought was particularly interesting is the number of charities, that there's quite a high percentage of charitable organizations. So, John, could we have the next slide? So I'm afraid I'm going to have a few pretty text-dense slides, and the reason for that is just, if we're going to share the information, it's actually captured on the slides. So for those organizations that are unincorporated, what that means is that your organization is actually an association that's a volunteer one made up of individuals. So it has no separate existence as an entity apart from its members. And in legal terms, it's not a legal quote unquote person. That's the terminology. So what that means is that there's no ability to own property in its name. And it's very important, if you are an unincorporated organization, to make sure that there are clear written rules and records that say whether your unincorporated organization's property belongs to individual members, the unincorporated association, or someone else. If it's not made really clear, and there's an instance where there might be a court case, the court might find that any property belongs to the group as a whole, and group members must decide by consensus what to do with it. So the other thing too is there's no separate protection from liability from members. So this is unlike an incorporated organization where you've got the entity, the organization itself. So there's limited liability in those cases, but not in terms of the liability for members of an unincorporated association. An unincorporated group can't sue or be sued in the name of the association. And John, this is, maybe we should have taken this out, the personal liability of members. We'll never mind that was not meant to be included, but it's sort of complicated in terms of if something is if wrong is done to a person, that the members of the association are liable for that. Next slide, John. One of the main recommendations for unincorporated associations, and I'm sure many of your groups, if you are unincorporated, is that there should be a document of association, something like a charter, which is used to capture the purpose of the organization and address things like membership, administration, and operation of the organization. So it's not a prescribed requirement of what the charter must contain. It's completely voluntary for that group, unlike incorporated organizations where there are very specific requirements, which I'll get to. So it's entirely up to the members to decide, but a best practice is that your organization, if you fit into this group, that you actually do have something like a charter so that it is clear what the purpose is and etc. So it's not subject to a lot of sort of debate or lack of clarity. The charter, and I'm calling it the charter, the document could be called a number of things, but for now I'm just using the term charter as a kind of working term. But it can set out how liability is shared amongst the members. But to the outside world, all the members bear responsibilities. So that's the sort of the key issue. So it's important to have your internal house in order, so that you can actually demonstrate that there is a clear, decision, and it is documented as to how any liability might be shared amongst the members. And finally, and I'll get to this again when I talk about liability more specifically, but liability insurance for an unincorporated organization is a really important consideration, regardless of the organization's incorporation status, and particularly with unincorporated organizations where the board doesn't have the protection that it does if it were incorporated. Next slide, John. So incorporated not-for-profits are separate legal entities apart from their members. They have perpetual existence, in theory, unless there is an actual sort of dissolution of the organization. And there's limited liability of the members. But of course, that doesn't mean that it doesn't obviate due diligence. So due diligence is a requirement, but beyond exercising, due diligence that's, well evidenced that the due diligence has been taken, then there's limited liability for the members. And it also allows for indemnification of directors and officers. An incorporated not-for-profit also has the ability to commence and defend legal actions in its own name, and it can hold property in its own name. Requirements for not-for-profit corporations, and I'm not going to get into a lot of these details because this is just really an overview. But articles of incorporation, which formerly would have been letters patent, but of course I think many of you are fully aware of the challenge of transitioning and complying with the Ontario Not-for-Profit Corporations Act. And I know that there was a previous webinar specifically on this subject, but it's important to just reiterate that if you're incorporated in Ontario, that you need to be in compliance with with ONCA, and that the bylaws meet the requirements of ONCA. So where it is required to specify that, the law, i.e. ONCA, is governing, that be reflected in the bylaws, your bylaws. And also, it's easy to kind of go through, for example, a transition to what's required by ONCA. But what is more of a challenge, I think, is the sort of consistency, the ongoing consistency to ensure that ONCA requirements are being adhered to. So actually developing, and they can be fairly simple procedures like an ONCA checklist, just to make sure that they're consistently adhered to. Because I think a lot of organizations, once they've done their, once they have their bylaws, they can kind of get parked, and some of it may not be explicit enough regarding what an incorporated not-for-profit actually needs to adhere to. So having a sort of a compliance checklist is very handy. And of course, there's an annual corporate filing that has to be done 6 months after the end of your fiscal year. And there are some liability risks for individuals, directors, officers that can arise by common law or by statute, but these can be mitigated. And due diligence obviously is one of the major mitigating factors, but there are other things too. Next slide, John. So when it comes to registered charities, and a large proportion of you indicated that you're registered charities, the benefits obviously that you can issue official donation receipts for gifts that you receive from individuals and corporations. You're exempt from paying income tax. You're eligible to receive gifts from other charities, other registered charities. So that could be other organizations that are charitable and also charitable foundations. And you can also have increased credibility in your community. Being a charity is something that has a lot of sort of value and currency in people's minds. And many of the goods and services you provide are exempt from HST, essentially. So the entities that can be charities, as I mentioned earlier, unincorporated associations can be charitable. And I've just noted again what an incorporated association is. And then the sort of formal term non-share capital corporations, which basically means not-for-profits, which is really, I think, all of us who have charitable status. And then charitable trusts. So that isn't really relevant in this instance, but there's three sort of categories of organizations that can have charitable status. Requirements of being a registered charity, and I guess I can't really stress this enough because there are such strict rules that must be adhered to. They must be a legal entity, and often a charity is a corporation, but not always. But as a corporation, the charity needs bylaws, policies, and procedures, meetings of its members, minutes of meetings, and proper books and records. They have to have a board of directors leading the organization, and that's usually specified as a minimum of 3. And I think that most of your organizations have larger boards than that, but that's really the minimum. And there need to be regular directors meetings with minutes. directors can have a measure of personal liability for the actions of the charity, which means that there is some risk associated with serving as a director. And you can only have eligible directors. And what that means is, things like people, not having people with criminal records and that kind of thing. So, there's information on who might be ineligible to serve as a director. And then obviously complying with various legislative and regulatory requirements, including those of the Canada Revenue Agency. And they also need to have the resources to carry out the mission of the organization, which is its charitable programming, which is the fundamental basis for having charitable status. Leslie, can you remind me when we're going to stop for questions?
Whenever you like.
Thanks. I thought you'd give me an answer. Okay, well, I'm going to just talk about the legal duties of directors, and this is a very brief summary of what the legal duties of directors are. I do have another presentation, which I would be happy to share a copy of, which goes into this a little bit more. So, it's something that you could contact Leslie and ask if you would like to have a copy of that. But in very short form, the fiduciary duties are a duty of loyalty, which is a duty to act honestly in good faith in the best interests of your organization, a duty of care, and then some of the sub-duties are confidentiality, conflicts of interest, and disclosure. And additional duties of directors of charities include managing charitable property, acting gratuitously, and that means, in a charitable manner. It doesn't the term gratuitous is sometimes used differently, and also being informed. But there's a lot of sort of, explanation and subtext to that. So we can definitely share that document if you'd like to have it on hand. Let's see whether we should stop for questions at this point. I think I'm just going to talk about liability and risk. And then I think we'll take a break for questions. So I know Leslie put in the chat, if any of you have any questions at this point, if you add them to the chat, then we can address those questions. I wanted to have not sort of save everything to the end if there are some questions sort of at this sort of partway point, I guess, or halfway point. But for liability and risk, one of the best sort of practices is to keep an inventory of potential risks and ensure that protection and mitigation measures are in place. So, if your organization is dealing with contracts and other financial obligations, making sure that there are proper approvals for those, and that there is proper follow-up to ensure that terms of agreements and contracts are adhered to. And then the insurance question, again, is really important. General liability insurance, but also directors and officers insurance if you feel that your board of directors may have any exposure to actually being, as individual directors, liable. And that's something that each organization has to weigh up what those risks might be. But if you have directors and officers insurance, that will help with that. And also, I just wanted to note that the insurance policies that are issued through our Ontario Nature Insurance Program, these were designed with our insurance broker and then to intentionally accommodate unincorporated organizations. So our insurance broker had a lot of discussions with the actual insurance company around this, because not being a quote unquote legal person, it's a bit different than an incorporated organization. So just to be sort of reassured, if you're unincorporated, that if you have an insurance policy through our program, that that's very much being sort of front and center in making sure that it applies effectively to unincorporated organizations. And then, ultimately, the liability and risk that your organization might be subject to really depends on the activities of your organization, what you do. I mean, there's a lot of groups, obviously, that do field trips and that kind of thing. Some are just more, indoor, talk kind of activities. So it's really important to consider all of the activities and identify where you think there might be risk, and look at how you would address those. So I don't know if there are any questions, Leslie, at this point.
Yes, there are a few. So our first question is, does an unincorporated nonprofit require public disclosure of a meeting minutes, or are those meeting minutes subject to audit, or is this only applicable to a charity?
It's only applicable to, you have to be incorporated for those requirements. So with unincorporated organizations, there's much less less cumbersome in terms of things you need to comply with, but I would say more latitude for things to go wrong because of not doing a sort of due diligence to protect the actual members. So if your organization is unincorporated and you have 50 members, let's say, all of those 50 members have exposure to liability. So the more an unincorporated organization sort of follows some of the best practices and procedures that an incorporated organization would do, the better, because you're basically covering your bases in the event that something might go awry, but you don't have to.
Thanks, Caroline. Our next question is, if you have a youth rep on your board, do they have the same legal duties?
Well, I don't know what a youth rep actually means. Would that be somebody under the age, not considered an adult in law?
I would assume so.
Yeah. That's a very good question, and I don't know the answer, but it's something that we can actually find out for you. And there may be follow-up questions too, and if there's questions that we don't get to at the end, we can follow up with responses. I would suspect that there would be a way to, if it isn't prescribed in law, I think there would be a way of actually making sure that their exposure is clearly limited. But it's a very good question. And it's great if you have a youth rep.
Great. Okay, next question is, how do waivers come into play vis-a-vis group liabilities?
Well, with insurance, I think, Leslie, you can remind me, but our insurance broker, did he give a general webinar on our insurance program and covering some of these things, or was it more to individual regional meetings?
He did. This was a few years ago now. I'm not exactly sure when.
Yeah. I think what I understand from him is that waivers are a good idea, but they're not going to get you off the hook. You can be named in a lawsuit even if someone signed a waiver. So it's it's a best practice, but it's not insurance that in the sense of not being subject to legal action would be my answer. But again, and I don't know if we have a webinar planned for all of the Nature Network on insurance, but he's our insurance broker. He's a great speaker and so good at explaining all of this. So I would recommend it.
Yes, if you're a part of our group insurance, then definitely you'll have Ross's contact, and he can answer that question for you better, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And if not, then if you're not part of our program, then reach out to your own broker or insurance provider.
But a webinar on insurance, I think, would be great, because it's amazing he can make it so interesting.
Yeah, it might be time for a refresher.
Yeah.
Okay, the next question is, we understand that Ontario Nature Insurance Program provides access to liability insurance. Does the insurance program also provide access to defamation insurance for incorporated not-for-profits?
No, we don't have defamation insurance. So there's actually 3 types of insurance that we offer. It's what's called corporate general liability, directors and officers insurance, and for those relatively small number of groups, insurance for land if your organization owns land, a nature reserve or that kind of thing. But I think the question around defamation that's again something that we should have Ross answer, and whether the CGL covers that. And John may know that too, because obviously as the editor of the magazine, we need to be insured against any claims of libel.
Caroline,
Yeah.
just to that, I think we had, I hesitant to answer because I'm not 100%, but I think we did have some
Additional?
But I'm not sure if that's the same package offered in Nature Network Group. So again,
Yeah.
sounds like we're almost due for as you say, a webinar on insurance alone.
Yeah, I think so. And Ross can answer all of these questions incredibly well. I mean, that guy is a wealth of knowledge, and he also explains things incredibly clearly.
Yep. Great. The next question is maybe also for Ross, but I'll just ask it quickly about separate liability insurance for properties and signage warning of hazards. So as Caroline mentioned, covering properties is an option under our group insurance program. I'm not sure if you have anything to say about signage warning of hazards, Caroline, on properties.
No, I don't specifically. I'm not sure if the question is suggesting that if you don't sign hazards that your insurance might not, there might be an exclusion from the insurance for land. I don't believe so, because sometimes it's almost impossible. And then what do you consider a hazard? I mean, the list of hazards could be almost endless if you took it, if you take it to an extreme. But we can check with Ross just to get clarity on that.
Yeah, I'm writing these questions for Ross down, so
yeah,
I'll get those to him.
Yeah.
Okay. Does the president of the board have the obligation to provide its board of directors with corporate liability for directors and officers?
Well, the corporate liability is for the organization as a whole, so it's not specific to the directors and officers. And the board president it's the directors collectively that are responsible for determining the organization's insurance needs, not the president solely.
Great. Okay, thanks. I think I've got a couple more questions. We'll maybe just do those, and then we might need to move on with the presentation. But if there's further questions, we can try them at the end.
Yeah.
So Frida, thanks for your suggestion that defamation might come under officers and directors. Could be. The next question is, we are a federally incorporated non-charity. Is there a benefit to consider switching to an ONCA incorporation?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't think that there's a huge benefit one way or the other. It's, if you're already incorporated federally, I don't think there's any reason to change. I don't think there's a particular benefit. I mean, there's somewhat different requirements federally versus provincially. And Ontario Nature had the same sort of question because we're transitioning to ONCA, and we did consider federal incorporation, but decided against it because it was just more straightforward to stay with Ontario incorporation at this point. But I don't know of any sort of major cons or pros really either way. It's, one of the big pros, obviously, with federal incorporation is that it's the jurisdiction, if you're working outside of Ontario as a jurisdiction, then you would probably want to be federally incorporated. And if you're working solely within Ontario, you could choose either. I think there are some advantages with the federal one is that they have more sort of online capacity for certain things. So I think there's some more sort of streamlined processes, but I wouldn't switch one way or the other. Generally speaking, unless there's a very specific organizational circumstance that sort of sways that decision.
Okay, and I'm going to make this one the last question. It's kind of a clarification on an earlier question. So specifically, does an incorporated not-for-profit need to publish director meeting minutes publicly? Or do they just need to be maintained and available? And is it a requirement of charities to post those?
No, it's not. You just maintain the minutes, and the minutes need to be available, particularly to members. So, non-board members of the organization. So a member, if they ask for the minutes of a board of directors, a particular board of directors meeting, for example, then they should be readily supplied to that member. But yeah, I mean, some entities do actually publish their minutes, but there's no requirement to do so. And it's really, for some entities, it's just a demonstration of complete transparency. And sometimes that's related to sort of a political situation, wanting to really demonstrate that transparency, sort of nothing to hide kind of message.
Great. Thank you. I think we will end the questions there and let you get back to your presentation.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, next slide, John. Thank you. Yes, so board positions, and probably all of your organizations have more board positions than the ones I've listed here, but the sort of core positions would be president, vice president, treasurer, and secretary, and often past president, and then other would be the other kinds of positions, whether you would call them just directors at large or whether they have a specific role within your organization. That would come into sort of the other category. But I think, one of the things that is really, really helpful, and I'm sure some of your organizations, if not all of you, do this, is having very clear job descriptions that state what the role and the responsibilities are for each of the president, the vice president, the treasurer, and the secretary, and the past president, if that's relevant. And then it is very clear how the board responsibilities collectively are assigned, and there's no ambiguity. And it also helps, I think, just generally, if the members know this as well because I think it's in a subsequent slide, but there can be a lot of assumptions about what the roles are without really it being sort of documented on paper, essentially, as to what those roles are. And then it ensures too that for example, the president isn't taking on roles that really ought to be fulfilled by the secretary or by the vice president. I think one of the things we hear a lot about is that presidents seem to shoulder a lot of workload. And I know other positions do as well, but there may be a lot of assumptions around what a president is supposed to do that aren't necessarily, they aren't givens. Sorry, just going back. Sorry, John. Yes, and then just with respect to delegated authority, it's not just what the responsibilities are, but also what decisions various positions can take. So that's really important in describing the roles and responsibilities, putting together the job description. Okay, next one. A non-native species, but this is a secretary bird. And I thought I would jazz up my presentation with this lovely creature. The most understood role, in my view, but I think generally, is that of board secretary. I think in a lot of instances, people think the board secretary takes the minutes and, opens the mail and does that kind of thing. But it's important to sort of consider what are all of the items that I've listed here that are, sort of typical roles of what a board secretary actually is. They do record and distribute board meeting minutes, but they're responsible for maintaining accurate records. They may schedule regular board meetings, and it may also be the president who calls board meetings, but it could be the secretary's role. They oversee membership lists, ensuring that contact information is up to date, and providing safekeeping of all official contracts and records of the organization. Another role is to hold board members accountable. So a secretary can be a bit of a watchdog if board members aren't pulling their weight sort of equally and not fulfilling their responsibilities. The secretary would track board member terms and also play a lead role in orienting new board members. So those are some things to consider in that role. It's not just about minute taking. So something, and I really don't have an idea about, all of the nature network groups, to what extent they develop, sort of board work plans and budgets. But it really is helpful to, it's sort of front end work, but it can make things operate a lot more smoothly and really bypass sort of misunderstandings or miscommunications. So, something obviously to consider is whether your organization needs a longer term strategic plan, what it wants to do over the next 3 years, or what are the key sort of directions it wants to take over the next, say, 3 years. And just 3 years is a sort of typical length. But an annual work plan, a board work plan with the responsibilities is super helpful. So, you don't know everything that's going to come up in the coming year, but there are a lot of things that are, givens, whether it's the members, the meetings, the monthly meetings, field trips, those sorts of things, but also when you have to file your charitable return and your corporate return, and there's when you have to renew your insurance, all sorts of things. And if those are documented in an annual work plan with dates and and also who's responsible, it provides a lot of clarity, and I think a lot of comfort too, because it's all documented and everybody has access to the same work plan. And then if there are new initiatives that emerge during the year, you may want to update that work plan to accommodate them if they're reasonably substantive. And then I think it's really important that someone has overall responsibility for the work plan. So has oversight and just makes sure that things are occurring according to the work plan, things don't get missed. Preparing an annual budget, which I'm sure most of you do, but having that budget based on the must-dos, the things that are, if you have known projects or events, and what funds you have available, and of course, what revenue you would be bringing in. In a lot of cases, it's primarily member fees, but there may be other revenue sources. And something that many of you may also do is, in maintaining a board folder on Google Drive, for example, so that there's ready access for all board members to the key documents that everybody should have their hands on. So they're not necessarily dealing with huge binders of papers, but they can quickly go online and find things like the articles of incorporation, the bylaws, the board terms, meeting agendas, minutes, annual budgets, and work plans. And then everybody then clearly has a responsibility to get the information that they need if they're a board member from this source. So I think it's in my mind, that's a really important good practice. Next slide, John. And then decision making. This is something that in my experience with various boards is that decision making could take a lot of time if there's no delegation of authority to individual board members. Officially, committees, etc., don't make decisions. The board makes decisions. But if the board has made a decision on, for example, a budget for the year, then the board doesn't have to discuss every single expenditure that might be coming up if it's in the budget. Or if something's very clearly in the work plan, then the board has taken the decision to approve the work plan and doesn't have to then make decisions about certain parts of the execution of certain parts of the work plan. I think this is something that is very frustrating to some board members, that meetings can go on and on and on, making trying to arrive at decisions over very sort of quote unquote small stuff, small things, and a lot of this can be dealt with by having these things like budgets and work plans. So it's something very important to sort of consider in terms of turning people off wanting to join a board, or wanting to get off a board because just fed up with getting into the minutiae at board meetings. So, if there's a budget, for example, the president and treasurer should be able to proceed with an expenditure if it's in the budget without full board discussion and approval. And if there's a work plan with clear assignment of responsibilities, the board member responsible should be able to proceed without full board discussion and approval. So those are just, this is all recommendations of things to consider. It's not a prescription. from me. It's just suggestions.
Caroline,
Yes.
some people are having a little trouble hearing you. If it's
Oh,
possible to move a little closer to your microphone or otherwise,
oh,
you sound okay to me, but some people are
okay.
saying that.
Okay. I'll try. I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay, I'll try.
Okay.
Next slide, John. And then examples of decisions that do need board approval, absolutely, are annual budgets, annual work plans, expenditures not in the annual budget, activities not in the annual work plan, and decisions around organizational policy. And then obviously if there are things like, a need to change the bylaws, the board needs to approve that to bring it forward to the members to be approved. So, there are very specific things that do remain the purview of the board as a whole. Next one. So just moving on to board workload and burnout. And this is what I was alluding to before. The president doesn't have to do everything, which, we all know the president doesn't do everything, but I think there's a bit of a feeling with that president role that individual is taking on sort of the lion's share, I guess, of the responsibilities. And so it's really important to consider what each of the board members' roles are, and that the president is really almost like a conductor of an orchestra, and doesn't have to play all the instruments as well. So just something to consider is whether you are president of a board or whether you're on a board and you feel like the president is responsible for perhaps more than they are as an individual on the board. Another thing, I know that many of your organizations meet very frequently, often once a month, I think, and just something to consider is how frequently the board actually needs to meet. Perhaps you can reduce that, but keeping meetings very sort of tight and on track with agendas. And this is, an important point, I think, with some people's reluctance or inability to serve on boards is the time commitment. For some people, it's sort of a social thing, and that's wonderful. But if you're trying to recruit maybe people who are a bit younger, who might have a lot of family responsibilities, busy careers, that kind of thing, they may not see a board meeting as, an opportunity to spend, a wonderful evening of 3 or 4 hours together as something that they can actually really realistically do. So I think there's a big barrier for younger people that, at those particular stages in their lives from joining volunteer boards. So something to consider. Minutes, officially minutes are meant to record board actions and decisions through motions, and maybe compile an action item list of, things to do or things that were agreed that ought to be done. But I think a lot of minutes can be more like almost like a verbatim notebook of everything that was said. So something to consider is whether you think that's necessary or whether it's, the individual board members can keep the notes that they wish to keep track of, but that the minutes actually be really short and to the point and be that record of decisions. And then I don't know to what extent, I know that, a lot of organizations do have volunteers from amongst the members who aren't actually board members, but there might be a fair amount of expertise in certain areas amongst the membership, and to delegate specific tasks to a non-board volunteer, I think is great. And I think there are more people who are keen on taking on a specific project or task that has a sort of a beginning and an end, and it plays up to their strengths. So just don't think that the board has to do it all if there is the potential for individuals amongst the membership to take on specific tasks. The important thing is that the task is well described and well circumscribed, so that it is something that can be delegated and doesn't feel excessively onerous to the person that's potentially volunteering to take it on. And of course, the work plans help, and clear decision-making authority helps with the whole issue of workload and burnout. So I think we're getting to the end, Leslie, so that's good because we're a little over time. Board succession planning and recruitment. I know I'm telling you things that probably most of you know, but it's good to kind of reiterate these, but being very clear about what kind of skills and experience you need on your board. So it might be bookkeeping experience or just generally strong organizational skills or a number of other things. And one of the things that I find a lot of boards do is that they leave their board recruitment activities, they kind of put it off until it's, close to critical. It's, the AGM is looming and we haven't, been talking to enough people or cultivating enough potential candidates. So starting early to cultivate potential candidates really saves a lot of headaches in the long run. And also being realistic about the time commitment of serving on a board based on the board position itself, like what that, what the responsibilities are of that individual board member, but also being realistic about individuals' availability. And then again, that speaks to, I think a lot of boards miss out, on younger, dynamic individuals with lots of ideas, but not a lot of time. That I think is a really important factor in considering who you might entice to put their name forward to join the board or to be elected to the board. And obviously playing to individual strengths, and there are hidden strengths too. So it's good to really identify what the particular strengths are amongst existing board members, but also who may be potential board members. And then having contingency plans to fill a board position if a current board member steps down, which could be for any number of reasons. I mean, there's all kinds of family and health reasons, for example, that might mean somebody can't continue to serve. And then I guess a final point is beware of the founder effect. So, some organizations were founded because of a very charismatic, visionary individual, or it could be a small group of, individuals who have the get up and go and the vision to create an organization, but the organizations aren't, the founder or founders aren't the organization. The organization is something that I think most people want to see sort of persist on into the future and become more and more successful. So, and then there can be the kind of feeling that if, with founders that they're kind of irreplaceable, or you have a founder who doesn't want to be replaced and sort of, can be a sort of an obstruction to the organization evolving over time. So yeah, finally, I just a few resources which some of you will be familiar with, but the sort of legal sort of requirements side of things. The Community Legal Education Ontario, and I think, Leslie, they did the ONCA presentation, right? The lawyer with them did the ONCA presentation. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. I love their website and the tools because it's such plain language, as so simply put and so accessible that it's certainly a great step. And you can go into things in more detail if you feel you need to. Carter's Law, for example, has numerous bulletins. They are primarily a charity law firm, but you do have to have a certain savviness in terms of understanding some of the basic sort of legal principles when going through their materials. But CLEO, Community Legal Education Ontario, doesn't, they're not presuming that you have any sort of great knowledge before you are reading what they put out. And then Imagine Canada also has some good information. So I think that's just about it. Oh yes, coming to a conclusion, I guess I included these honeybees because I think we can learn some lessons from nature when when individuals and groups know what their jobs are, what they're seeking to achieve, they can achieve amazing things. But if you don't have all those pieces in place, then it can get a little bit chaotic. So I thought honeybees were a good sort of symbol of how nature works, and we should look to nature perhaps for some guidance.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Caroline. I'm on a few boards and have been on a few boards in my life as well, and there's lots of good information there to be used for all different types of organizations. So thank you so much. I just wanted to point out to anybody listening that the webinar on the Ontario Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, ONCA, that Caroline referred to a few times, we do have a recording of that. If anybody's interested, just email me and I can share that presentation with you. Okay, so we do have a few more questions. So we have one group who has a board who has voted to rebrand, to create a new name while retaining the corporate name for business purposes. And they're wondering if it's necessary to seek the approval of your members through a voting process.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that I don't know what sort of size organization and how many members. I think it would be good practice to seek the approval of the members. Certainly if you were changing the corporate name, you would need to, but I think it fosters, a feeling of sort of engagement and collaboration and transparency. So I would recommend doing so.
Thank you.
Also, just sort of one thing is if you are changing your name and it's different from your incorporated name, and if you're a charity, it'd be different from your charitable name. There is a bit of a drawback, and Ontario Nature itself suffers from that problem because we're still the Federation of Ontario Naturalists, and we did try to change our name to Ontario Nature, our incorporated name, and we were refused at the time. But it does mean that if anybody's looking for us, say on the CRA, the Canada Revenue Agency website, in the list of charities, they can't find Ontario Nature. They have to know that we're the Federation of Ontario Naturalists. So it's just something to consider. And I did notice that a number of nature network groups who have changed their names have changed their incorporated name as well, and they've done so successfully. And I shouldn't name names because I might have the wrong ones, but I think Nature London may have done that, and anyway, I noticed a couple when I was doing my research, and I thought, oh, well, they obviously were approved to have their name changed.
Okay, thank you. Another group says they seem to be working okay without a president and vice president. Is it a requirement that these positions be filled by the group?
Well, it depends if you're incorporated or not. And ONCA, I believe, does require that you specify the officer positions, which are typically the president, the vice president, the secretary and the treasurer. If you're unincorporated, you can kind of do what you want, and you just need to be, do your due diligence to make sure you're not going to get into trouble, but there isn't any legal requirement.
Thank you. In regards to delegation of authority, would you recommend to do this by title? For example, having titles like Director of Communications, Director of Relations, etc.?
I think it's whatever works for your particular organization. There are the sort of formal board positions, which are sort of the standard ones, like the president, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's helpful. I mean, we're talking about primarily organizations that are all volunteer. So you're not, for the most part, you're not boards with paid staff, or sometimes there are paid staff, but those staff don't have the authority. They don't, they're not executive director type of staff. They may be project staff. So the positions that you might have if you were an organization with staff are fulfilled by board members. So I think it actually can be quite helpful to be really clear, like those examples: director of communications, communications director, etc. And that does help with clarity, but I think it doesn't, it doesn't bypass the need for having very clear sort of position or job descriptions for each.
Great, thank you. Next question is, what does a group do if the original reason they were formed has been resolved or no longer exists? For example, saving a forest and it ends up saved. What next? I know we have had some groups that have had this.
Well, I mean, the thing that organizations say is that if you've achieved you're super successful if you don't exist anymore because you've achieved your mission. So I would say, I mean, I think one of the things that does happen is that organizations feel like they need to kind of continue to exist even though they have achieved the reason that they were created. But I don't think that's a good reason to persist. I think it needs to be pretty clear what your future path is going to be. And if you're struggling to find a reason to exist, I would recommend not existing. And just, if you've been successful, patting yourselves on the back, and it doesn't mean that you can't, a new organization that certain individuals with the original organization, isn't created at some point in the future. But existing just because you're there and trying to find a purpose, I think can be problematic.
Yep, sounds like good advice. Yeah, we just had one comment that an organization did just change their corporate name, so it can be done.
Oh yeah, it can be done. It's just if it's something, in the case of Ontario Nature, I think the response we got was it was too generic. I can't remember because it was quite a number of years ago. And I think, it's possible we might have another kick at the can because of this problem, where people don't know that we're actually the Federation of Ontario Naturalists if they're looking us up. Though Ontario Nature is a registered business name, it's not our incorporated name, it's not our charitable name. So, I would recommend it, and I would recommend trying. And I disagree with the fact that we were turned down, but I think it was just, they tried to determine if it's unique enough that it's sort of exclusive to you as an organization, or if it's too generic, then you could be refused.
Okay. One more question that's kind of a follow-up to a previous question. Is it common for executive boards to include positions beyond the usual president, secretary, and treasurer, such as the example of director of communications?
Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, I mentioned those positions specifically because for incorporated organizations, those are sort of the, you know, the standard positions, the expected positions. So there can be other positions, you know, as you suggested. So I think I had mentioned you could have members at large, which don't have a specific sort of job description assigned to them, or something like, you know, director of communications or director of advocacy or director of, you know, whatever your whatever your organization actually needs.
Yeah. Yeah, lots of boards have different positions like newsletter editor or things like that as well. Another question about dissolving. So in this case, it's an example of a group that couldn't fill the positions and they decided to dissolve. Is there a designated process for doing that?
That's a very good question. And, you know, again, it depends on whether you're incorporated, whether you're charitable, what assets you have. If you have assets that were charitable gifts that are, you know, somehow externally restricted, you know, designated for a particular purpose by a donor, then there's a whole process to, you know, that needs to go with that, because you need to make sure that the, you know, intent of the original donor is fulfilled, however, whatever that looks like. So it's a difficult question to answer because it's really depends on the situation of the organization. Not only the, you know, the whole incorporated, charitable, or neither, but yeah, what kind of assets it might hold. So, you know, a lot of bigger organizations would actually make sure that they had funds for legal counsel in winding up an organization, but, you know, in other instances that it may not be necessary.
Okay, thank you. One more question just popped in, so we'll do that one and then maybe we'll wrap it up. So this question is, do board members usually have defined terms like 1 year, 2 year, 3 years?
Yes, that's I think something that I didn't mention, but it is really good practice to have defined terms. And I think I can't remember the details, but I mean, there are requirements if you're incorporated to have those terms defined, and also so they could be, you know, for example, 2-year terms, but up to 3 successive terms. So, you know, somebody might be able to serve on the board for 6 years. What you want to avoid is having the same people on the board for years and years, and you have no sort of, you know, turnover, you know, the leadership isn't being refreshed, and then having staggered terms is really important too for continuity. So you don't have, you know, a bunch of people that come on and they're all on for, you know, maybe 6 years in total with 3 successive 2-year terms, and then they're all off the board at the same time. And then you've got a heck of a recruitment issue.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the presentation, Caroline, and